Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? It's. You can't hear me, really? Oh, okay. No, I don't think it's as loud as it needs to be. Yeah. Okay. Is it up now? Okay, great. Yeah. All right. Anyway, as I was saying, good evening and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine, and it's really a pleasure to welcome back Elliot Ackerman, who's here this time to discuss his latest novel, which he co-wrote with retired Admiral Jim Stavridis, entitled 2054. This is the second time that Elliot and Jim have teamed up on a work of fiction, and they make for quite a powerhouse duo. Although they have different skills and perspectives. They both have lots of military experience, but different kinds. Elliot served several distinguished tours in Afghanistan and Iraq with the Marines, and later as a CIA paramilitary officer. He then took up journalism, living in Istanbul for a time and reporting on the civil war in Syria. Jim spent more than 30 years in the U.S. Navy, rising to the rank of four-star admiral and serving as head of U.S. Southern Command and later as the top military officer in NATO. Both Elliot and Jim also have published other works, though again of different kinds. Elliot has written, I think, 6 or 7 previous novels as well as 2 memoirs, and Jim, who is known not only as an accomplished sailor but also a strategist and scholar, has written 5 nonfiction books and co-authored 4 others. The first novel that Elliot and Jim did together, 2034, came out 3 years ago and imagined a situation in which a naval clash between U.S. and China in the South China Sea and the piloting of a jet, U.S. Military jet, into Iranian airspace set in motion a cascading series of events that led to a global conflagration. The new novel is a similarly captivating thriller. It's set 20 years later, in 2054, and the cast includes some familiar figures from the previous book, but the trigger this time is different. It's the mysterious death of an American president, and of course I'm not going to give away much. Let Elliot do that. But as America descends into civil war, a number of authorities in the book struggle with concerns that the president's death may somehow have been connected to a new biotechnology that can alter human cells by remote gene editing. As Publishers Weekly said in a review, the book paints a sweeping and resonant portrait of a world faced with a powerful technological advancement it doesn't fully understand. The results are genuinely chilling, and I'll just add that the book is both a great read and a cautionary tale for us all. Now, Elliot is appearing without Jim this evening, but in conversation with someone who also knows quite a bit about national security affairs, New York Times investigative journalist Mark Mazzetti. Mark primarily covers national security, intelligence, and foreign affairs. He joined the New York Times nearly 20 years ago after stints with the Los Angeles Times, U.S. News and World Report, and The Economist, and he's shared in 2 Pulitzers given to groups of New York Times reporters in 2009 and 2018. His own coverage over the years delving into secret operations carried out by the CIA and by parts of the U.S. military grew into a book, The Way of the Knife, which came out in 2013. Please join me in welcoming both Elliot and Jim.
All right, welcome everyone. This is the kind of day in Washington where you sort of wish Politics and Prose had an outdoor event space. Get on that, Brad. But thank you for coming on this nice night, and dive right into it. First of all, it's great to be here with Elliot, who's a friend and someone who I've admired for his not only his career before he became a journalist and writer, but even more once he became one, and is one of those people who, as someone who's tried to write, who wrote one book and would like to write more, is somewhat annoying because he's so prolific, and he does, and everyone he does is better than the last. So it's really a great pleasure to be here tonight. I thought we jump into this with, as Brad said, this is the second book in what will be a trilogy
Yes.
of the future. And in the first book, 2034, you dove into largely the topic of nuclear war. And now you're moving on to something that is far scarier, the state of American politics. And I should say, though, for this crowd, there is a silver lining. In 2054, D.C. is a state. So that's something we can actually. there's not much. There's not much great in the future, but that's one thing. But let's start out by you giving a little sense of the landscape of the American political system in 2054.
Sure. It's great to be with you and great to be in Washington, D.C., my hometown. So, and I know Jim's sorry he couldn't be here tonight. Our schedules actually just couldn't intersect for this, and so I called dibs on Politics and Prose. So that's why you've just got me. So in 2054, it basically takes the story in the world of 2034 forward 2 years. So there has been a nuclear war with China. We've seen the rise of India. And in the wake of that nuclear war, what we've also seen, and this is sort of a projection out of current trends, is that the Republican and Democratic parties have increasingly become minority parties. So we all know today that the plurality of Americans identify as independents. So, and actually today both the Democratic and Republican parties are minority parties. So that comes forward, and sort of into that power vacuum after the wars of 2034 enters a very charismatic new political figure, a guy named Castro. He likes to quip that if the United States could elect a president whose middle name was Hussein, they can certainly elect a president whose last name was Castro, which we have done. And but the two great challenges facing the U.S. in the year 2054 is that we have a president who wants to continue to hold on to power, and we have this rising new technology, which is artificial intelligence, becoming extremely aggressive and hurtling us towards this idea called the singularity. With anyone who's not familiar with that idea, it's really it's the moment when we stop controlling the technology and the technology really starts controlling us. And it gets into these ideas, the integration of not only our technological evolution as a species, but also our biological evolution as a species. And this all comes to head kind of in the first chapter of the book, in which President Castro basically drops dead. And there's a question as to who or what killed Castro.
And it should be pointed out that at that point, Castro is serving his third term as president.
Yes.
So it gives you a little sense of where we're going as a country.
Absolutely, and his party so he basically is a charismatic figure, and the party that has sprung up around Castro is known as the American Dream Party. And the two rump parties that exist now that are really, I guess, the minority parties, is this sort of strange fusion that's occurred between the radical wings of the Democratic and Republican parties. And basically, as both parties shed membership to survive, they have to merge, and they become Democratic Republicans, which is not without precedent. We actually had a Democratic Republican Party in this country right after our founding. And we have histories of this country of sort of strange political alliances, like in the 20th century when you had Northeastern liberals in the same party as Southern segregationists in the Democratic Party. So you sort of have this, you have the American Dream Party on one side of the partisan divide in the United States, and then the Democratic Republicans on the other, but they just go by the name of truthers. So the tension in the book is between the truthers and the dreamers.
Right, and I found, like, as I'm reading the book, I'm trying to figure out who I'm really
You are?
supposed to be rooting for, or
Yeah.
are there good guys here? And I really couldn't find any.
Well, I think the obvious point is, we're trying to write a political book into an extremely fraught political space. So you don't want to write a book where immediately half the people are going to pick it up and throw it out the window. So as a writer, you have to kind of create a construct for which you as the reader don't necessarily know where you exist on the spectrum here. Are you a truther? Are you a dreamer? Who knows? And so by kind of creating that reality, I think it allows us to tell this story of an America that is recognizable to the one we live in today, but also, fundamentally different. And unlike 2034, where we were really writing into the near future, we're writing right now kind of up at the periphery of science fiction.
Right. There's some like incredibly far-fetched things that happen. Like there's a riot at the Capitol.
I know,
That'll
crazy.
never happen.
That'll never happen. Never
Yeah.
happen.
I want to sort of jump between the politics and the technology, and they're sort of obviously fused in the book. But there's so many interesting things to talk about. You brought it up before, this concept of singularity, which is central to the book, and I will be the first to admit that I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know about who came up with the idea, or at least who popularized the idea, and so I raced to Wikipedia. And but I wanted to, but talk a little bit more about how you gravitated to this. First of all, explain a little bit more to people what it means, and how you and Jim gravitated to this as a sort of central concept for the novel.
Right. So the singularity was, there are many people who've talked about it, but it became very much slipped into popular culture about 20 plus years ago when a guy named Ray Kurzweil wrote a book called The Singularity is Near. And there's been much debate today as to whether or not the singularity is near, or perhaps maybe the singularity is actually already here. But the idea of a technological singularity is, again, as I said, it's that moment where our existence as human beings becomes one in which the technology is not something that we control. It's become almost smarter than us and controlling us, but it's also fusing with us at the exact same time. So like we can see, little like this is part of the singularity. Like we can't go anywhere without this. 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. COVID vaccines are part of the singularity. We just went through as a society a massive undertaking where we, most of us injected ourselves with a technology that was not solely biological. And so there's a moment in the book where one of the characters sort of poses this question of, are robots going to inherit the earth? Are we going to live in a future populated by these sort of strange cyborgs? And the answer to that question is yes, the robots will inherit the earth, but they will be our children. Meaning that we and our technologies that we've created will just sort of fuse into one another. And we're seeing the antecedents of that right now. I mean, Elon Musk has been installing chips into people's brains. But we'll also see it, I think, in the way that we receive medical care. We're already seeing the antecedents of this in the CRISPR vaccines, in the way that those types of technologies, which are biotechnologies, can get smaller and smaller. So, we have microchips now that are getting down to the size of molecules. So what happens in our society when microchips and molecules become interchangeable? How does that affect us? When we cure things like blindness, do we become cyborgs? I mean, so the book kind of, it gets into a lot of these philosophical questions, and it kind of peaks in a political crisis, because ultimately, too, what we're talking about is not just our biological existence with all this technology. We're also talking about our psychological existence. And I think, again, with our phones, we already have changed the way we interact with one another on a societal level and on a political level. So you start to see that in the book. And so the book really kind of is a double helix of a book. You have a political crisis, but you also have this scientific crisis, which is this race towards the singularity.
Obviously, in the last year, the discussion about AI has kind of exploded in a popular realm with the launch of ChatGPT, and it sort of created this discussion that's sort of binary, which is are the machines going to destroy us, or are they going to save us from ourselves? Right. And I mean, it seems like in the future that you envision, it's like it's a little of both, but that's not even a easy to say if this is a good or a bad thing. It is just going to be a thing that we are going to have to adopt to. Is that overstating it? Or?
No, I think it's like the old saw. Maybe some of you have heard this. There's two fish swimming along. One fish looks at the other fish and says, "The water's really nice down here," and the other fish looks at him and says, "What's water?" Meaning it's what you swim through, it's what you exist in. But I think there's one thing that we all probably can feel, whether or not we articulate it, which is that right now we're living at the dawning of an age. And the dawning of the age is this nascent technology, artificial intelligence, and it's moving very, very quickly. From a cultural point of view, I would say, like, why do we think a movie like Oppenheimer just won Best Picture? I would contend it's because it tapped into something in the zeitgeist. And the thing that it tapped into is people can feel that we are at the dawning of an age, just like we were at the dawning of the nuclear age in 1945. And one of the things that comes up in the book is there is, in effect, what I would call almost an arms race in the book, but it's a technological race. And that the types of arms races and technological races we used to see between major Cold War powers in the 20th century, we're now going to see between nations and even non-state actors in terms of technology. And whoever can arrive at that point of technological explosion first, that real hockey stick in computing and AI and otherwise, will so quickly outpace its rivals that there's a huge incentive to get there first. And so you see in the book, after Castro drops dead, and there's this question of what killed Castro, the immediate secondary question is, and who has this technology? Because whoever has it is going to probably have an outsized influence on what our future is.
So you bring up Oppenheimer and sort of raise the questions of, the person who creates this and then comes to regret it or, be horrified by what he's done. I thought a little bit about it with, you've got this character, Kurzweil, right, who I won't give away too much of the plot, but he, there is this sort of Heart of Darkness subplot, right? He's up the river, right?
He's up the river.
He's up the river, and he's sort of checked out of society, and it's sort of, you don't have to give away as much as you want, but the question in my mind was, is this someone who ultimately becomes, not that he invented this, but he sort of came up with, popularized this idea of singularity. Is he horrified by what the future came to be because he identified it so early, or do we have a sense of what he thinks about what he identified so long ago?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when Jim and I were kind of outlining the book and talking about the book, it's part of this trilogy we've done, or in the process of finishing about at least what we perceive as being the three great challenges of the 21st century. The first being war with a peer-level adversary, which was China in 2034. This one being the singularity and civil conflict in the U.S. And the last book, which will be 2084, is going to be about the environment. But as we were sitting there and having all these conversations about the themes we wanted to address in the book and also the story and how we wanted to take the characters forward, we were talking a lot about the early days of AI, and we kept talking about Kurzweil. And at a certain point, I think I was actually when I was like, well, we just make him a character in the book. There should be like 100-year-old Ray Kurzweil who's like wandering around these pages, and there's this question of, do they or don't they find Kurzweil? And so we just sort of decided to do that kind of recklessly, but then got to a certain point where, maybe one or two lawyers at the publishing house said, hey guys, you want to make sure you don't do anything that's going to get you sued by Ray Kurzweil. So, because he is a real, he's
still alive.
He's still alive, and
yeah.
we sent him the book, and and I say that I very much say that tongue in cheek, but because he was still alive, there was sort of some fourth wall stuff we were dealing with, and I don't want to give anything away. But when you ask what does Ray Kurzweil think, well, he's both, very much a real person, and then sort of a character that lurks in our book. But he lurks in the book in such a way where we weren't creating, scenes of direct dialogue where Kurzweil's talking to you, because also that didn't seem to serve the book right to, to place a real life person into a fictional universe.
So back to the politics for a little bit. You've got a character in the book who is reading another book, Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and you have a passage from Democracy in America at the end, and so obviously you're thinking about Tocqueville's view of the United States in the 19th century. And why did you decide to sort of make this, directly raise this as a sort of something for the readers to think about the state of American democracy today? or 30 years from now.
Well, I think, listen, there's a very probably obvious kind of metaphor we're making in that the president dies and he's killed. This remote gene editing process is basically something that affects his heart. So his heart kind of gives out on him in a mysterious way, and his body collapses due to a new technology. And it's a book that's also very much about the body politic in the United States. And the health or lack of health in our body politic. So specific to that de Tocqueville reference to kind of, if you want to get under the hood of like writing the novel, there's a lot of machinations inside of the White House in terms of, the president dies, there's a weak vice president, who's going to really have the power, what is the succession strategy, and when the president dies and the vice president assumes the presidency, a new vice president is brought in for the minority party. He's a very charismatic figure named Shriver. But he's immediately cut out of power. So we wrote this scene, and I think I had written the scene, and it was Shriver sitting in the White House cafeteria, but nobody will hang out with him. Kind of like, everyone, he's been thoroughly shunned. And so but he refuses to be locked away in the VP's office. He wants everyone to see him. So he goes and he plops himself in the White House cafeteria every day, where he reads really big, like pulp, like romance novels. And so the character goes to talk to him and sees him reading the novel. And I think at a certain point, Jim was like, okay, that's fine. But like, couldn't he also be reading de Tocqueville? So I was like, all right, he'll read de Tocqueville too. And that brought de Tocqueville into it, which I think was a nice way to kind of get at some of these macro themes while keeping it light too, where, I like that he also enjoyed his like trashy pulp romance novels.
Well, and we should tell the audience. So Shriver is who's Shriver, and who's he descendant of?
Well, he's sort of a mashup. He's a descendant of Schwarzenegger, Maria Shriver, kind of he's like a blue-blooded son of California and Massachusetts. I think we describe him as being everything to everyone. Right. Sort of very promising, but he is a Democratic Republican, so a truther, but when after the president drops dead, there's a deal, basically a political deal is arranged so that Shriver can assume the vice presidency and be in the number 2 slot for the future of the book, which I don't want to spoil.
Well, as I'm reading it, I'm just sort of thinking of you guys just sort of clearly having fun, right? Like you gave a descendant of the Terminator is going into the future, is in the future, yes, saving the future.
I didn't think about it that way, but yes, yeah, it's like it's a reverse Terminator.
Yeah,
yes,
reverse Terminator. Right. So it's fun writing about the future. I'm just sort of on a sort of nerdy writing process sort of question. I'm interested in how you and Jim Stavridis do this. What is your process? I mean, how did you guys hook up on this? And how is writing a novel with someone else work?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, the way this project first came about was we just by total coincidence have the same editor at Penguin Press, a guy named Scott Moyers, and Jim had come to Scott with this idea of doing the first book, 2034, and they talked about it. And Scott had said, they did a number of nonfiction books together, but never any fiction. And he said, I work with this guy, Elliot Ackerman, like maybe you and Elliot would like to work on this book together. And what Scott didn't know was that Jim and I already had a pre-existing friendship. We both went to the Fletcher School at Tufts. He had me there one semester as the writer in residence. When I asked him what my duties would be as writer in residence, he sent me sort of a very military style like memo with a bunch of bullet points in it, and one of the bullets was talk with the dean about books whenever he feels like it. And I only bring that up to say that we sort of had a pre-existing conversation where we talked about books. We knew each other's sensibilities. So when the idea of doing this book with him came up, it seemed like it would be pretty doable. He's a very deeply literary guy. I mean, he reads everything. But on the other hand, I got out of the Marine Corps as a lowly captain, and he got out as the Supreme Allied Commander, and I didn't want to be in a creative position where I was arguing about prepositions with the Supreme Allied Commander. So I'm like, all right, let's make sure that we're friends, but just because you're friends doesn't mean you should be writing books together. And we sat through 2034. We said, let's see if we can write the first chapter. When we outlined that first chapter, had story meetings, talked about it. Eventually, there's always someone who's going to sit down, who's got to be in the seat, and imagine that it's a pulpy romance novel on the desk, and so I usually take first crack at the drafts of a chapter. I hand it to Jim. I'll have things like in 2034 it was like big naval battle happens here, or things where I want him to fill in, and we kind of just go. we bat a chapter back and forth between the two until we think it's in good shape, and then we go to the next chapter. And that's how we've written all of the books.
So can you, I'm going to turn it over to the audience in a bit. Can you give us a preview of 2084?
2084.
So you said you were well along the way for the next book, and when will we see that?
Oh, knock wood. I think we have a first draft, and I think that will probably be the year after next. We both have projects of our own that will come out next year. Then after that, we'll have 2084. I think will come out. And that book, it's about it is about the environment, but now we are really into the future and really writing science fiction. And the crisis is basically one of land reparations. And so in that book, you basically have a coalition that's come together called the Consortium, which is almost like a NATO-like coalition that includes the two big nations are China and the United States, and they have in effect the equivalent of an Article 5 provision that an act of climate aggression against one is an act of climate aggression against all. But those are all sort of nations who've come out of the climate crisis okay. And there is a large inhabitable band that is sort of spread around the world from many other nations that are demanding climate reparations. And so they send a fleet towards the very northeastern part of the United States, and they're going to grab some land. And so the book is sort of about the crisis that exists when they try to grab that land.
Final question. It's sort of on looking at these three books. Did you find it easier or harder writing a book further out into the future than the last one you wrote?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really different experience. I think you can, and I'm not just being a salesman here, but I think you can read both of these. You could read 2054 without reading 2034. They're kind of they're very different books. The characters come forward, so I think if you've read 2034, it's fun to see what those characters are doing. But thematically, they're dealing with different questions because the challenge that we face with artificial intelligence is completely and our democracy is very different than what we face in the national security space. So I think that it just has a very different feel. So I don't think it's more difficult or less difficult. You definitely have fewer constraints, and you can really kind of let your imagination go when you're way into the future. But with fewer constraints, you also have more options, and that can be difficult.
Is everything going to be okay, Elliot, in the future?
I don't know. I'm really hoping. I can't tell you if it's all going to be. Everything's going to be different. That's all I can say.
So a lot of people here and also standing up in the back. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. So if you have a question, if you could step over to the mic here and line up and ask your question.
A University of Maryland professor has discovered a way for people to live to age 150, and it's being tested on rats and then beagles, and it'll be tested on people starting in about a year. Do you think this technology will be allowed to become commonplace, and how does that fit in with the singularity?
Sure. Thank you for that question. So I'm not aware of that technology, so I'm speaking a little bit from a place of ignorance. But if we look at present trends, I think it's probably looking in the future. Lifespans are going to be extended, and many of these treatments, I think, will probably stop looking as though they are solely biological treatments, and we will see that they are also technological treatments. And the line between what is technology and what is biology will become increasingly porous. And so that has, I think, probably all sorts of ethical questions that it poses, and in parallel with dealing with these technologies and what they can actually do, we'll also be dealing with the ethics of those technologies. And we've seen that, since the debates about cloning in 2000 up to the present day. But it's an incredibly interesting time, and technologically speaking, things are moving very, very fast. So yeah.
Do you guys sort of consult with ethicists and medical ethicists, technology ethicists when you're or when you were doing this book? To sort of we had a few readers who we were bouncing ideas off of. One of the actual things in this book that was really helpful is
3 of Jim's children are physicians.
Okay.
So we were kind of actually talking through, like, there's the autopsy scene. Like, we got a lot of help in that autopsy scene from his son-in-law. So I think, we go specifically to folks to kind of ask certain questions. And then, as you point out, then you start getting into the future and you realize, there's no one that really has the answers to these questions. They're just people's opinions and speculations. Then it's our job to kind of just imaginatively try to take those ideas to their conclusions.
Hi, you and Phil Cly are 2 of my favorite thinkers in the world, and I just think that prolific is a great way to describe you. So this transcends the book, but I'm just super curious about what your day-to-day life looks like and how you go about deciding what ideas to care about and to pursue in a literary way.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. I was actually just telling Mark, because Mark and Phil went to the same high school, that since the pandemic began, I'm on a 3-way text chain with Phil and one other writer. So a lot of my day is trying to ignore Phil when he's sending me texts about stuff.
Phil's a prolific texter.
He is a
apparently.
prolific texter, yeah. Hopefully someday those will all be in a book. I think my day-to-day life is, or at least my work life is, I have these projects and they, take a while, and I kind of know where I'm at in the cycle of those projects. So, so a lot of reading, a lot of writing. I also, do work as a journalist, and that kind of, I think, gets me out in the world in a good way. So, one of the things I like about my work is like I mean, some days are the same, but no like 2 to 3 month period is ever exactly the same. And so I feel very fortunate that kind of, I think, keeps me on my toes and allows those experiences to sort of, filter into the writing I'm doing. And oftentimes for me, like the journalism I'm doing will often feel like kind of a first draft, and those ideas will find their ways into the novel. And I could, in any of my books, probably show you the pieces that I wrote that are almost like directly inserted into novels later on. So, yeah, but thank you.
More questions?
Hey, Elliot.
Hey, Hans.
I haven't read your book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. I've read almost every other book. I'm interested in what you're going to say in the book about the Civil War, which seems to be developing. I read the blurb, and it says society in 2054 is moving in the direction of a civil war, presumably between the dreamers and the truthers. And there are elements in that civil war of biotechnology and sort of who's going to be on top of it. But what, not having read it, what does that Civil War look like? I presume it's not states against states, back to 18. What does it look like, and how do you? And then, thank God you didn't entitle this 2024.
Right. Yeah. I think, for us, it really starts to look like, and again, without spoilers, so I'm going to speak a little bit in generalities, like kind of a real schism in our national psyche. In that our body politic becomes schizophrenic, and there's fundamental questions of, who killed Castro and what does it mean, and we can't seem to land on what the truth is. So that is sort of what that Civil War feels like, and then those questions kind of start playing out in the streets, and you see. All of these books have been told where they have a form. There's sort of 5 principal characters, so the macro themes, but you're also getting like a soda straw view into what's going on. So, for instance, there's one character named Julia Hunt, and she is the adopted daughter of Sarah Hunt, who was an admiral in 2034, the one who dropped a couple of the bombs, and she works at the White House as basically a Marine liaison there. But you see like the war in the streets through Julia's eyes. So, what does it feel like? It feels a little bit like the events we've lived through in the last 5 or 6 years, but then kind of on steroids. But you'll have to read the book to find out the whole thing. There are no pitched battles in the book, though.
Right.
Okay.
Hey, Elliot. Hey, Mark. So I was just wondering, was what happened, the death of Kennedy and the mystery around, was there a conspiracy, like who, how did Kennedy get killed? Like, was that your model when you said, like, who killed Castro? It kind of made me think, like, who killed Kennedy.
Did Castro
who killed
kill Kennedy?
Yeah. I just was wondering if that was in your mind somewhere.
Yeah, I think that using the name, I mean, sometimes like a name will just pop into your head and then it just kind of stays there. And you're like, oh, name Castro. Like, why not? And I don't know. I liked it because I felt it was like a little bit provocative, kind of because it hits different notes and people are asking themselves like, why is this person called Castro? But then it also hits on this question of certain like we have all these truths that seem to be like hot takes in American society right now, where the left has a different version than the right, but there is like sort of this like the fundamental, at least I think of almost like our at least the conspiracy theory of conspiracy theories in American life has always been the Kennedy assassination, and so I think that was just sort of a nod that this figure is a gesture towards our towards how sometimes in American society we cannot agree on what the truth is.
Now that conspiracy has since been taken over by the Kate Middleton conspiracy. So,
Which, yes.
So that's
and inquiring minds, yeah, want to know.
Your next book's gonna have to deal with that.
Yeah.
But I mean that I have to say that's one of the I guess scary, eerie aspects of reading your book is that it's not like you're watching when you're a kid watching the Jetsons. Like this is clearly futuristic. Like yes, this is set 30 years in the future, but it feels very much like what we live in right now, and sort of back to your comment about the fish, like this is what we know, and there's a few things like suborbital flights that they're doing which are clearly haven't been achieved yet, but for the most part, and obviously aspects of technology that haven't yet been achieved, but a lot of it feels very familiar, and it wouldn't take very long to get to that point from where we are right now.
Absolutely,
in a good and bad ways.
I mean, I've spent a lot of time. I lived in Turkey for many years. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and I remember, oftentimes I would speak with, my friends who were from there, and we'd be talking about some issue, and and they would say something effectively like, yes, Elliot, and they would say something to me like, sound like, the CIA is actually the one that does X, Y, Z, and I would always sort of like, this is like 10, 15 years, I'd always sort of like kind of like roll my eyes when the conspiracy theory would come, and I'm like, God, I can't believe you guys believe this, like whatever, and now I feel like I live in that society, and I'm like, why was I so sort of arrogant to roll my eyes at all this stuff? And I'm like, and to me, it's when you live in a society where the fundamentals of kind of what is an agreed upon narrative, what is a truth, are so much up in the air. You inevitably get a lot of conspiracy theories. And I think in American life right now, we have just many, many divergent versions of what the truth is. And it didn't used to be that way. And so I think, that the conspiracy theories aren't just fun. They're also like a real canary in a coal mine. And for a democratic society to work, fundamentally, there has to be a certain foundational agreement on the truth. And I feel like we are drifting away from that. And so that is certainly a theme in the book.
I feel like I had the same experience in certain countries 10, 15 years ago where I was thinking, oh, you're incredibly cynical to these people accept this view of their government as so conspiratorial, and this is exactly where we are.
Where we are right
now. Sir.
Hi. So India played an outsized role in 2034. Did you get a good response from the Indian public reading this book? Like, did you ever do a book tour there, or because they generally tend to love when India's, portrayed positively, particularly in like popular culture. So.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'll say I didn't get a bad response from India. Nothing. There's nothing overwhelming per se, like from India. But I think that at the end of 2034, that was sort of the provocative question that was raised. And I think for us in the book, it was. Yes, it was a commentary on India. It was almost more, though, a broader commentary on the way wars work, right? So like in 2034, we start with this idea. There's going to be, and we set their day one writing. There's going to be a book about a war between China and the United States. And so like I'm a novelist, so, I think I'm okay at my job. So I'm writing, and it's turning point, like obviously the end of this book can't just be like, and USA wins, or China wins. Like that's a pretty boring end of a book. Your job is to sort of subvert the reader's expectation. So with that in the back of, my mind and Jim's mind as we're talking, like, okay, like how does this thing end? And then we're thinking back to like, history, the Second World War. How did the Second World War end? And it's like, that was at its outset, a war in many ways, between, you could say Britain and Germany or Russia and Germany. And I would argue that, really the country that kind of like won the Second World War, or was at least the great beneficiary of the peace, was the United States. And we were the great beneficiary of the peace because we were sort of the last ones to come in. And we inherit that peace. And so with that question, like, well, who would be that country? Well, like, if the U.S. went to war with China, I mean, it'd probably be India. And so that was sort of how that kind of major thread in the book came into being. And we've been criticized. Some people have said, like, there's no way India is going to be in the position where you have it by 2034, and that might be the case. I mean, these books are not designed to predict the future. They're designed to speculate about the future and hopefully get people thinking.
And is 2054 better for India or worse?
I think India kind of stays on its current trajectory. It's a book that is much more, I would say, it's a little more domestically focused than the last one is, and we focus a little more down in South America. Thank you.
More questions?
All right, so I'll step in as one of the staff to ask a question. So I was interested in the singularity, or how you would consider singularity in other contexts. Thinking of things like as statecraft as a form of technology, or even religion as a form of technology. I had a religious studies professor who talked about human evolution going through axial periods. We go from tribal religion to a personal religion, and the evolution of statecraft. Do you think that there is a way in which, how does religion and statecraft play into your books, and how do you imagine it in the context of, like, have we seen something like the singularity that we're going towards in the past?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and something I know I was thinking about in the book, which is that, what are technologies, right? Technologies are there are human creations.
Yes.
Like, what we create are our technologies. So we create, in our nation, we created institutions. Then we also create machines. But our institutions are fundamentally a technology, and so our technologies can often be our downfall, but they can often be our saviors. So this book, yes,
saviors are a technology too.
Exactly. Yeah. And religiously speaking, saviors are a technology. And technology can become a religion when you just believe in technology for technology's sake. I mean, you can keep going down this, sort of intellectual path. But in the book, there are lots of technologies that we focus on using that kind of broader definition. And one is obviously this biotech, remote gene editing. We talk about that. But as the plot starts to accelerate, you see we're also seeing the technology of our government and how it works. And there's sort of a House of Cards-esque cycle that is occurring inside of the White House. And hopefully, as a reader, you're wondering whether or not our institutional technologies will be able to deal with all the shenanigans that are going on between the truthers and the dreamers, while in parallel, and the book is a little bit of a double helix, you have a group of characters who are chasing down Kurzweil in the singularity to try to understand what this technology means for not only our country, but also the world, because whoever gets it first and arrives there first is going to have like a massive technological head start on their adversaries. Kind of like what we're seeing, right now with the U.S. and China, as we're, racing each other towards advancements in AI.
Thanks.
Sure. You said you sent a copy of the book to Kurzweil. Did you get a response? Do you have any sense of
We
what
did not. I think he is up the river in Brazil, where he is in the book.
I'm dying to know what he thinks, and I'd love to know more about him too. It's a fascinating character. So, any more questions? All right. Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark.
So copies of Elliot's book are available at the checkout desk up front. He'll be here signing. Please form a line to the right of the table and help our staff.